I wanted to spend a few minutes here talking about an anniversary this week. It was the 25th anniversary of the 1993 King of the Ring, which I've said on this podcast before over the years many times is one of my all-time favorite WWE shows. If I made a list of my favorite pay-per-views, Royal Rumble 1992 would be on there, obviously. King of the Ring 1993 would be on there. And ECW One Night Stand 2005 would absolutely be on there. Those three are guarantees. And probably Money in the Bank 2011 as well. And those are just the ones that are off the top of my head. One thing that was very interesting in some of the stuff I was reading about the show that I did not know about up until recently is that Papa Shango, he wrestled that night. And not only did he wrestle that night, he wrestled Owen Hart in a USWA Heavyweight Championship match. Papa Shango had beaten Jerry Lawler to become the USWA champion. Lawler and his Memphis territory there had a working agreement around this time with Vince McMahon and WWE. In fact, Vince McMahon himself, those famous sort of early Mr. McMahon, evil heel Vince McMahon promos were from Memphis television. Vince McMahon recorded a series of heel promos on Jerry Lawler that aired in Memphis in 1993. It was a very surreal thing to go back if you watch the YouTube segments. But pretty cool. You can clearly see the early sort of makings of the Mr. McMahon character. But up until recently, I had no idea that Papa Shango, A, was the USWA champion, and B, defended the title against Owen Hart in a dark match before the pay-per-view went on the air. So that's one of those interesting little factoids I think most people probably wouldn't know about. But once the pay-per-view went on the air, it was all, to me, and even watching it back recently as I did, it was the Bret Hart show. And that was one of the things I've always loved about this show because you guys know, I've said it before, if you had to pin me down and ask me who's my favorite wrestler of all time, if I had to name one, I would pick Bret Hart. I'm a huge fan of Bret's work, especially from that 92 to like 94 period. And then again, the sort of heel anti-American Bret Hart stuff from 97. I was a big fan of his work. When I was younger, and even as I've gotten older, I go back and watch those old matches. There is absolutely nobody that I could think of right now in WWE off the top of my head, aside from maybe somebody like an NXT, like a Johnny Gargano, who, can take a beating as believably as Bret Hart did in his matches, and just the story he would tell, the psychology. I mean, you hear these words a lot, but it's true. Like, Bret Hart would take an ass kicking for a good part of his matches, but he would do it in a way that just came across like you felt bad for him. Like, man, this guy's taking a beating. He'd take the corner chest bump, and just the way he would sell pain and agony. He was so good at that. He was so much better than anybody else, and Shawn Michaels and anybody else in the company at the time. He was a number one. And, obviously he was done dirty at WrestleMania 9. And so, I always just sort of assumed that this was their make good to him because he was no longer the champion and Hogan had sort of stolen his thunder and he wasn't getting the belt back, at least not for a while. And so let's throw Bret a bone here. Let's take this King of the Ring concept that had always been a house show gimmick. It was a house show draw. It goes all the way back to 85. In fact, many years ago, I did a King of the Ring special edition of the Sound Off. And it might have been episode 227. Don't quote me on that, but it was somewhere around there. If you want to go back and listen to it, it's in the archives. I did an entire episode devoted to the history of the King of the Ring as an event. And it goes all the way back to 1985. And actually, it wasn't episode 227. It was episode 278. I remember that now because it was the 20th anniversary. So here we are now 25 years later. But it was the 20th anniversary of King of the Ring as a pay-per-view. And I devoted a whole episode. That was 278 if you want to go back to the archives. And there were some pretty unique winners and some pretty unique matchups back then. But it was just a way to sort of sell tickets and bring people in. It was never televised. I don't think it was ever even mentioned on TV. Maybe after Harley Race, that's sort of where the whole King gimmick came from when he came in. But and Bret himself, this was actually his second King of the Ring win, not even his first. He had won the tournament in 91 at a live event. He beat IRS in the finals to become king back then. So, this is not an event that Bret was any kind of stranger to. And if you watch the show from start to finish, they told the story from the very first match, the opening match with him and Razor Ramon in the first round, right up until the finals, right up until the coronation when Jerry Lawler beat him down. You know, as a guy who had to go through this tournament and had busted up fingers and other ailments and was able to persevere and win in the end, and didn't win a single match in the tournament with a sharpshooter. It was all sort of fluky wins. It was some move in the Razor Ramon match coming off the top rope where he ended up pinning Razor. It was a small package reversal, how he beat Mr. Perfect in the semifinals. It was a victory roll, which I don't think I ever saw Bret use before. That's how he beat Bam Bam in the main event. So he never actually used his move. It really is one of the great, I think, all-time performances in this company. And the Bret Hart Mr. Perfect match in the semifinals is my favorite of the two great pay-per-view matches that they had in WWE. Everybody talks about the SummerSlam 91 match, which was a great match. And it had the aura of Madison Square Garden. It had this great dramatic finish where Bret, as he yanks back on Perfect. Now, Perfect probably, he gave up. I say tapped. There were no taps back then. Back then, you had to verbally... Back in my day, you had to verbally submit if you wanted to quit the match. And Perfect gave up too soon. I mean, his back was just thrashed at that point. But still, this great dramatic finish where Bret uses his signature hold and cranks back, and the crowd goes nuts, and his family's in the audience. And I remember even after the match was over, I think what happened is Perfect got up and he sort of kicked Bret in the ribs on his way out. And Bret just literally tore his singlet off. It was like ripping it off like a vicious animal. It was a great match. But the King of the Ring match is still my favorite of the two. There was a great little sort of back and forth promo between them before the match where they referenced the SummerSlam match, and Perfect said, I owe you for SummerSlam. And then they went out there, and that was the best that Mr. Perfect had looked since he came back to WWE the year before. Came back to in-ring action, that is. And a couple of memorable spots, too, in that match. One where Bret got knocked off the apron and he hit the guardrail. But if I remember, there was... I don't think he wasn't a cameraman, but it was some kind of like ringside crew, some staff person who got caught. Like, Bret landed basically on top of him. The guy was safe. He wasn't hurt. But on the landing, when Bret hit the guardrail, this guy was like trapped underneath Bret. I think there was also a suplex spot where Bret may have suplexed Perfect or vice versa, but they suplexed him over the top rope and they both tumbled out to the floor. And that's an old Bret Hart spot from the Stampede days. If you watch any of the stuff from Bret's DVD, they may have some Stampede stuff up on the network. Bret, in his matches with Dynamite Kid, would use that spot a lot. And it was a dangerous spot then. It's a dangerous spot today, where you basically just do a vertical suplex and drop the guy out over the top rope, and both guys flip and they hit the floor. So I just loved everything about that match. I just thought it was just fantastic stuff. The handshake at the end, the show of respect. Bret moves on to the finals. I just can't say enough good things about it. Not every match on the show was a winner. There were a lot of duds. I liked the Shawn Michaels Crush match. They had a match for the IC title. There were other matches that were just not very good. Hogan Yokozuna, not very good. That was Hulk's swan song. As far as big WWE shows, I know he wrestled live events with them for another month and a half or whatever it was. But I saw this week that Bruce Pritchard and Conrad Thompson had done an episode of Bruce's podcast devoted entirely to the 93 King of the Ring. Being that I guess it's the 25th anniversary, and I assume that's the reason that they did it. And one of the more interesting points, and I was hoping Conrad would bring this up, and he did. Shout out to Conrad, by the way. He does a great job with these things. But what came up was the rumor that the plan for SummerSlam 93 had been Hulk Hogan against Bret Hart, with Hogan putting Bret over for the championship in the main event. And the long-rumored story of a photo shoot or a pay-per-view poster that had Bret and Hulk posing with the belt and doing a tug-of-war over the title, all of this was raised on the show. Now, nobody, by the way, has actually ever seen that poster. There's a couple of fan-made photoshops online. Those are fake. But in Bret's book, he talks about there being a television taping up in Canada. It was up in Halifax, the month before King of the Ring, that's where the photo shoot took place with him and Hulk. Pritchard on his podcast confirmed that it did in fact, the photo shoot did in fact take place. So sitting in the vault somewhere, and I don't know why WWE.com hasn't dug this up already, because they're always finding rare things and photos to kind of put on their YouTube channel and put on their social media. And I don't know why this has never leaked out. There is somewhere a photo of Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan having a tug of war over the WWE belt, which I'm sure looks a lot cooler than the Brock Lesnar-Roman Reigns tug of war for the WWE title, but we won't talk about that. Now, it's not that I had any reason to doubt Bret's sort of accounting of events. Bret, in his book, it's so weird because his book is so long. I've read bits and pieces of it. I've never read it cover to cover, start to finish. I was more interested in the WWF stuff, but one of these days I'm going to go back and just sort of start over and read the whole thing. But he gives very specific dates and times and details. I had no reason to doubt that his accounting of the events in his book was made up or anything like that. But it's nice to have an independent party verify that it did actually take place. They also went into how disappointed Bret was that Vince McMahon told him, look, this is the plan for SummerSlam. It's going to be you and Hulk. And then in the end, Hulk tells Vince that, he won't put Bret over. He wanted to put Yokozuna over instead because he was the big heel monster. And Hogan made a career out of feuding with and slaying the big heel monsters. In fact, on his website many years ago, Hogan, I don't know that this is even printed or available anywhere now, but I remember it was on Hulk Hogan's website a number of years ago. Hogan once gave his version of events, so I think this was from the website and not his book, but I didn't read his book, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But he wrote about this, and this is going back many years, and in his accounting of events, Hogan claimed that he was leaning more towards Bret than he was Yokozuna, which is why they did the photo shoot in Halifax that I just mentioned. He also confirmed the tug of war, so I guess there's your other independent party verifying that it did happen. But Hulk's issue was that Bret was a babyface, and so was he. And Pritchard touched on this on the podcast too, but this is, again, this version of events is directly from Hogan himself and something he wrote many years ago. He said that the only other time they did a babyface versus babyface match with him was him and Warrior, WrestleMania 6. And he said it split the crowd. The crowd was divided even after the match. He said Bret was just starting at that time in 93 to come into his own as a single star. And for him to go up against Hulkamania, brother, he thought ran the risk of Bret getting heat for it in their feud. And in Hogan's view, that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, a cynical observer might read that and say, Hogan's right, but what he actually was worried about was him being booed in the match and not Bret. I think, even though crowds like in 92 were starting to boo Hogan and get tired of Hogan, just go watch him get dumped out of the 92 Rumble. The place actually, there's like a big cheer when Sid throws him out of the ring. So there was a segment of the audience that was already beginning to tire of Hogan in 92, and he went away, and I think him going away helped a lot because when he came back in 93, there were no boos. Hogan came back. He was getting big crowd reactions. He did the night on Raw when he came back at the Manhattan Center. He did at WrestleMania. Even when he won the championship, that whole bullshit finish, people went nuts. At Caesar's Palace, they were going crazy for the finish. And when he came out on this show at King of the Ring, got a very nice, thunderous reaction from the crowd. So I honestly believe it would have been more a Warrior-Hogan dynamic as opposed to, let's say, Hogan-Rock, where the fans just turned on The Rock. I mean, that poor bastard. He didn't have a fan in the house in Toronto for their WrestleMania match. I think it would have been closer to a Warrior-Hogan deal where both guys are getting their fair share of cheers from the crowd. I don't really think either guy would have been booed had they gone through with that match at SummerSlam. I don't see the people booing Bret. I really don't. People seem to genuinely love Bret at that time. I remember, Bret tells how back then he was getting more fan mail. More fan mail would come to Titan Tower in like that mid-90s period for him than anyone else. He would go overseas, and you saw it in 97, right? When he would get booed in the U.S., but he would go to Germany, and he would go to, obviously, Canada, but he would go to Europe, and the guy was a rock star. For whatever reason, Bret Hart had some kind of weird connection with the fans where they genuinely, and I know Bret loves to kind of, kiss his own ass a lot and blow smoke at himself and, think he's maybe bigger than he is. But, the fact of the matter is Bret really was legitimately that popular back then. So we'll never know what the dynamic would have been had they gone through with that match. The match was in Michigan, I think, right? It was in, not Pontiac, it was in Saginaw, I think, is where SummerSlam took place in 93. I have no idea what the crowd reaction in Saginaw would have been, but this was Hulk's argument against Bret. This was his argument about not going with Bret and going with Yokozuna instead. And Hogan, in what he wrote on his website at the time, even mentioned that WrestleMania match with Rock as an example of what he was talking about, where the crowd turned on Rock. Rock came in as the babyface, and, people just were not having any of it. So as a way to protect Bret, because you see, Hulk was only looking out for Bret. As a way to protect Bret, Hogan decided to put over Yokozuna instead, which, in his words, allowed Yokozuna to get even more heat with the audience, and it gave Bret this great monster heel to work with after Hogan had left the company. Because look at the way that Yoko squashed him on this show. Yokozuna didn't just beat Hulk Hogan. When the match was over, he quite literally squashed him. He gave him a bonsai drop. Hogan had to be helped out. And so because of the way that Yoko squashed him on this show, the idea was that whoever finally did beat Yokozuna, which Bret did at WrestleMania the following year, in Hogan's mind, that person would have bragging rights to say, hey, this guy did what the Hulkster couldn't. This guy did what Hulk Hogan couldn't do, which is beat Yokozuna clean, straight up, one-on-one. So in Hogan's mind, this all made sense. Now, that is not a terrible argument. That is actually one of the more sensible things I've heard Hulk Hogan write about or say in his life. I have my doubts. Suffice it to say, I have my doubts about Hogan's real intentions here. Now keep in mind, if Hogan was so interested in helping Bret Hart get this guy over as a top guy, why the hell would he ever agree to a finish like the one that we saw at WrestleMania 9? So I don't buy for a second that he cared one iota about Bret Hart. Now, at the same time, Hulk Hogan, old school guy, heel versus babyface, babyface versus heel. That's how it was always done. That's how he made his money. They would bring in monsters like Stud and Bundy and Kamala and all these other people, Earthquake, and Hogan would make a lot of money with them. It was a formula that worked for him. It was a formula that made him the most popular wrestler in the country. And so one could see why he would think that way. In his mind, that's just how it was always done. Crowds in 93 were down. Now, granted, Bret was only champion for the first 3 months or so of the year, but he was still positioned as one of the top stars in WWF. You could argue that with Bret on top, business was down as compared to the year before. Live attendance was, anyway, I don't know about TV ratings, but from what I've read and everything else, business was down even more in 93 than it was in 92, and business was down in 92 also. Does Hulk Hogan have a point? That's a great question to pitch to all of you guys. What do you think? Based on Hogan's accounting of things, was it the right move to have Yokozuna squash him so that Bret Hart could get kind of viewed as being a bigger deal when he beat Yokozuna? Or was Hogan putting over Bret directly at a show like SummerSlam? Would that have meant more to Bret's career? There is not a doubt in my mind that Hogan versus Bret would have been a far bigger match for SummerSlam than Bret Hart against Yokozuna or Yokozuna against Lex Luger, which there's another dent in the whole, oh, it's all to put Bret over argument. They decided to go with Lex Luger as the new Hulk Hogan, not Bret Hart. Bret Hart was on the back burner for the rest of 1993. If it wasn't for the fans cheering Bret the way they did in the Rumble in 94 when they did that whole double elimination thing, it's very likely that it would have been Lex Luger celebrating with the championship at the end of WrestleMania 10, not Bret. But to me, Hogan versus Hart was the bigger match. That's the match that should have happened at SummerSlam. But again, I pitch to you. I want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Does Hogan have a point?